The following program contains graphic images of violence and may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. My name is Gottfried Hagen. I'm the director of the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies. I'll also be the moderator for today's panel. Ladies and gentlemen, today individuals and institutions around the U.S. will be are commemorating Martin Luther King, the hero of the civil rights movement in the U.S. 1 year ago, a series of events got underway in the Middle East, which shares, I think, many of those goals, striving for civil rights and human dignity. 4 weeks after Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia to protest the treatment by local authorities and police, pressure mounted in Tunisia, and it was on January 14th, 2011, that President Ben Ali fled the country while Muammar al-Gaddafi strongly condemned the protests in Tunisia, and we all know what happened in the year after that. On January 17th, another protester set himself on fire in front of the Egyptian parliament. And again, a whole series of events unfolded. So for both chronological and political reasons, Martin Luther King Day seems to be an appropriate occasion to take stock of the movement that we've come to call the Arab Spring, and to take stock and also to look forward, since there's so much in flux still and there's so many open questions that I hope our experts can answer today. So let me introduce our speakers. At the far end, Mark Tessler is the Samuel Eldersveld Professor of Political Science here at the U of M. He is also our Vice Provost of International Affairs and an expert on public opinion who has worked all over North Africa, the Middle East, and also in Israel. Next is Sarai Aharon, a Schusterman visiting Israeli lecturer with the Frankel Center of Judaic Studies, who has come to us from Bar Ilan University in Israel. Then Wijdan Alsayegh, a lecturer in the Near Eastern Studies Department, who's part of the Arabic flagship program there, and teaching on women's rights, women's writing, and activism. She has also been, I think she needs to be, she deserves special credit for that. She's been instrumental in bringing Yemeni Nobel laureate Tawakkul Karman here last fall. Then we have Mrs. Sussane Koelbl. She's a reporter for the German weekly Der Spiegel, and currently holding a Knight Wallace Fellowship here at in journalism here at the University of Michigan. Atef Said then is working on his PhD in the Department of Sociology here at U of M, and in prior to coming here, he was active as a human rights lawyer in Egypt. And then we have Professor Juan Cole, Richard Mitchell, Professor of Near Eastern History, well known through many, many media appearances and through a blog that continues to be a prime resource for everybody who's following events in the region. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the panel, and I'll turn it over to Mark Tessler.
Thank you very much. This is a very full panel with an awful lot to contribute, people who know some of these countries very, very well. So we've been asked to keep our comments short, so there'll be time for discussion. We're striving for 6 to 8 minutes, and I will do my best. So what I want to do just at the introduction is just, it's really impossible to generalize. It's difficult to generalize about the region. So I'm going to raise 3 broad questions and suggest a couple of things about each one, some of which I think will be answered in much more detail by various members of the panel. The first is, how should we, I'll say what the 3 questions are at the beginning, or the 3 topics. One is, how should we think about the motivation or the drivers for the Arab Spring? Some people have said that, gee, this wasn't predicted. And my response to that is, you know, all you so-called experts, how come you didn't predict it? My usual response to that is, we did predict it. We predicted it every year for 20 years. And finally, it happened. So how should we think about what the drivers are? Second, where does Islam come into the picture? Both in general and especially given that in Tunisia and Egypt, the Islamic parties, or the Islamist parties, have done very well. They've carried the day in both cases. So how should we think about that? And the third, which I don't have much to say about, but I want to at least raise it because I think it is, in a way, the question going forward, is how should we think about what comes next? What are the uncertainties and the unresolved questions that we'll be watching? And maybe some of our panelists will have some answers. With respect to the question of drivers and motivation, the term that you hear very, very frequently, that I think if one understands it, or at least if my understanding of it is correct, is a good way to think about this, is the term dignity. And sometimes when Americans hear this, they think, well, that means that people are kind of thin-skinned and they take insults too personally. That's not what it means at all. It's not a psychological term. It's not that people have some sort of a crisis of identity. It's that, and it's a generalization, but I think it's a good generalization, and I heard this very frequently when I was in Egypt this summer, that people want to be respected by their leaders, by their government, as human beings who deserve to be cared about, who deserve to have the resources of the state put at their disposal. And they find in many cases, of course this is a generalization, but they find in many cases that they're not respected, that leaders are primarily interested in enriching themselves and ensuring their own continuation in power, and that there's a lack of respect for ordinary people and their lives. And it's in that sense that I think dignity captures something very, very important, that people want leaders who take them seriously and believe that they are entitled to a decent living. And although this is a generalization, very often people find that there is money in their society, maybe in some cases not enough to totally alleviate poverty, but what is available is being used to enrich a small group of people. And you can see in Egypt, for example, people in the garbage dumps making a living. And if you go to the other side of the Nile, you can see limousines lined up in front of luxury hotels for $100,000 weddings. Something is wrong with this picture. The people are not being respected by their leaders. So that's, I think, what the closest thing we have to a generalization, and it's captured by the term dignity. The question of Islam. This is a subject that I've been looking at in my public opinion polls, and I want to say that we have recent data from Tunisia and Morocco. I co-direct with a series of partners, most of whom are Arab. One is an Arab American, something called the Arab Barometer, and we've been doing public opinion surveys, large, representative, probability-based national samples. And although the attitudes go up and down and they change, we have a pretty good idea of what people think about the issues of the day. And there is some support for what we might loosely call political Islam. It's a term that probably requires some time for definition that I'm not going to follow up right now. But the idea that Islam should play an important role in political life. But this is not the majority, this is not the view of the majority of citizens. Most people want democracy. And most people, even though they're religious and their religion is important to them, believe, that's not everybody, there's a sizable minority that thinks differently than the main point that I'm giving you, but by significant margins, the majority thinks that religion is important, but it's a private matter and it ought to be left apart from political life. So I think we want to be a little bit careful about sort of assuming, as maybe nobody in this room does, but Americans often do, that somehow Islam is driving everything. People are not looking for a system, by and large, that brings with it some sort of Islamic law, and that there's high support for pluralism and tolerance and those kinds of things. That raises the question that, well, then why have the Islamic parties been doing so well? And they have a core constituency who doesn't agree with the point of view that I've just articulated, and of course they get support from them. But by and large, and again, this is a generalization, and our people who know Egypt or maybe Tunisia can see if they agree with this analysis, but I would say, and I think the evidence would support, that people are voting for these parties not because they're endorsing an Islamic agenda, but because these parties are believed to be, and presumably are, credible. They've cut their teeth in opposition to the regimes that deny dignity to people, that people feel deny them dignity, and that they're well organized, they're long-standing, they're more effective in bringing their people to the polls. In general, they're known in the neighborhoods. And so there are a lot of very practical and tactical and everyday reasons why people vote for these parties and why they've done as well as they can. And it's not to say that Islam is not important. Our surveys show that most people are religious and take their religion seriously. But in terms of why these parties have done so well and what ordinary people want as an alternative to the regimes, the old regimes, it's not about some sort of Islamism. If we had time, maybe we could explore that in more detail. Probably already my 6 minutes are already gone. It's amazing how quickly they call when you're talking. But in terms of what comes next, I think from my point of view, I'm looking forward to being informed about this and maybe, if necessary, corrected. But I would say right now we really don't know. There's just an awful lot of uncertainty. What are the Islamist parties going? What is the Ikhwan and the Noor going to bring us in Egypt? Is the military going to step aside? What's going to happen in Syria? What about Libya? What's going on there? Are we done with disturbances and protests in Bahrain, or are they going to continue? In addition to all these questions that are on the agenda, but not yet resolved with respect to internal dynamics, we need to think about what the changing shape of the regional character might be. And I don't have time to talk about a lot of these things, but there are a lot of unresolved questions. Hamas, for example, in Gaza, is traditionally allied with Syria, is finding it difficulty to maintain its support to maintain its association with the Assad regime. Friends of mine, Palestinian friends who work there, say that there's a lot of grassroots anger at Syria because of what it's doing, and as a result, there's pressure on the leadership of Hamas to redirect some of its external relationships. At the same time, Egypt, which had been a very strong supporter of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, is changing, or at least exploring the possibility of changing its point of view. So we may see a very different configuration there. Probably most of you are aware of what's going on in Iraq, at least in a general sense. Is Iraq going to be an ally of the United States? Is it going to be closer to Iran? What are the implications for Lebanon if things change in Syria, where so much support for Hezbollah has come from Syria and through Syria from Iran? So there's a lot of important questions, and they have to do both with the uncertainty of the domestic agenda or the domestic fallout in a lot of countries, but there's also the prospect, and I would say even the likelihood, although what it's going to translate into we don't yet know, that the regional alignments and the international relationships, or the international relationships in the region are going to look very different as well. So the Arab Spring has really shaken up the apple cart, and maybe in a few places, we don't know, maybe the military is going to retain its control in Egypt, and maybe when things settle down, Egypt won't look so different after all. kind of think that's unlikely, but it is a scenario that's being talked about. But in the larger sense, we're looking at a Middle East that is probably going to look pretty different in the years ahead than it has looked pretty consistently for the last couple of decades. So those are some topics for reflection. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So the next speaker is Wijdan Alsayegh. How do we get the presentation up on the screen? Okay.
Please forgive my English language because I thankfully arrived to this wonderful country just 2 years ago. So I would like to start with a question. What does the Arab Spring mean? I strongly believe that this revolution is not just a political revolution aiming to bring down Arab dictatorships, but a cultural revolution in general, and it is a women revolution in particular. So you could clearly see that the role of women in this revolution is significant. For the first time in modern Arab history, women are leading the change in Arab countries. To brief demonstrate why I consider this revolution a cultural and social revolution, here are 4 brief reasons. The social structure. This revolution is changing the social structure. Women of the Arab Spring have the power to change Arab women stereotypes and to build a new social system, replacing the patriarchal system with its many social taboos. They refuse to listen to those who would say, you should not or you could not follow your dreams. They became leaders, decision makers. They are supported by their families, fathers, brothers, husbands. And also, male revolutionaries are proud of having women present in this revolution. For example, they named Tawakkul Karman in Yemen, they named her the Queen of Sheba. They named Ayat al-Qurmuzi in Bahrain the symbol of Bahraini resistance. Normally, it is very painful for any Arab woman to acknowledge that she was raped according to Arab culture, that she was raped or tortured, or her virginity was checked by men. But in the Arab Spring, the revolutionary women are speaking up, who were raped or tortured are speaking up to and demanding the persecution of offenders, and these brave actions are supported by protesters. For example, Iman al-Ubaidi, she is a Libyan lawyer. She was raped by Gaddafi forces, and she spoke up to expose them and to demand their persecution. Her brave action was supported by revolutionaries. And please take a look to this part from her case.
We have found Iman al-Ubaidi, and tonight she risked her life to speak out. You remember the Libyan woman arrested and dragged off after telling reporters she'd been raped by Gaddafi forces. Tonight she defies Gaddafi officials who she says have continued to harass her and threaten her. She's defying them by talking to us. She says she's in hiding in Tripoli and has been told not to talk about the brutality she says she suffered and the brutality she says she continues to suffer. She's fearful for her life tonight, but says she has nothing left to lose. This, of course, is how the world first came to know her after she snuck into a Tripoli hotel full of journalists a little bit more than a week ago, screaming she'd been raped by Gaddafi's forces, gang raped by 15 men, bound and tormented, held captive. She had scars and bruises to prove her story. As she spoke, hotel workers revealed themselves to be government agents, They assaulted her verbally. One pointed a knife at her. Then one of them threw a coat over her head, and eventually she was hustled away. A few days later, Libyan state TV ran a tape of a woman being interrogated. It was Iman, it turns out, lying on a floor. Voices of people taunting her could be heard, telling her to do interviews on Libyan state TV, withdrawing her story. She refuses all of it. The government said that she was drunk. They said she was mentally unstable. They even called her a prostitute. The Libyan state TV anchor says right here, comparing her to a prostitute was insulting to prostitutes because, and I'm quoting here, even a whore feels patriotic about Libya.
On the same page, Ghada Kamal, she is an Egyptian pharmacist. She was dragged, kicked, and beaten in the street by military because of her participation in protests. And this icon, this picture became like the icon of Egyptian revolution. And this picture also destroyed the military reputation. So please take a look to her. And also her brave action, she spoke up to expose the military, and to demand their persecution. And her brave action also supported by protesters. And please take a look to this.
بالورقة والقلم خدتيني 100 قلم أنا شفت فيكي مرمطة وعرفت مين اللي اتظلم بالورقة والقلم خدتيني 100 قلم أنا شفت فيكي مرمطة وعرفت مين.
So the next point is the religious system. This revolution reforms the religious system. Each Friday, female voices were allowed to speak loudly in chanting slogans or public speeches to lead the people as female imams, although outside the mosque. Male worshippers reject the religious speeches that attack women leaders. For example, in Yemen, the imam was removed from the mosque stage by worshippers because his speech attacked Tawakkul Karman. They did not let him finish his speech. Normally, a woman who wears hijab, she cannot touch a man. But women of the Arab Spring who wear hijab, they shake hands with men. The literary field. This revolution caused a significant change in literary field. For example, Nawal Saadawi, she's a writer, and she was blacklisted by the government and by the establishment. Yeah. Okay. Because her writings spoke up against the political and social taboos. She attended this, she participated in this revolution, and she attended the Tahrir Square protesters as a revolutionary woman. Stereotype, Arab stereotype. This revolution shows the world that the Arab people hold flowers instead of guns, use peace instead of violence. And one of these revolutions started on Valentine's Day. And even they named their revolutions, they give their revolutions flowers name. For example, jasmine flowers, Zahrat al-Sabbar flowers, and full flowers. My final word is, in the Arab Spring, the gentleness of flowers and love beats the sharpness of swords and blood. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Alsayegh. Our next speaker is Atef Said.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this very exciting and important panel. My brief note is about human rights situation in Egypt, and I believe human rights situation may give us a good perspective about the trajectory of transitional period. Many may recall that one of the main slogans of the Egyptian revolution, and as Professor Tessler touched upon, was human dignity. The revolution, after all, was sparked to protest police brutality. And one of the famous icons of the revolution was the face of Khaled Said, 26-year-old activist, a blogger who was tortured to death in Alexandria. After the mass revolt that started on January 25th, Egyptians succeeded in ousting Hosni Mubarak, the 30-year-old ruling dictator. Before leaving office, he transferred authority to the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, hereinafter SCAF. This transfer has become the center paradox in the revolution, in the sense that part of the ruling regime, elites of the military class, and Mubarak's hand-picked generals, and many of them are Pentagon's friends, leading the transition to democracy and to end the rule of the very regime that they are part of. It is also paradoxical, of course, that in the first place, an institution that's based on hierarchy, such as the military, leads transition to democracy. So from February to mid-March, Egypt experienced a very awkward problem, constitutionally speaking, which was, that's question, on what basis SCAF is ruling or administering the transition? Through a mandate of power transferred to them from Mubarak, or through a mandate from the people of the revolution, or simply by physical force. At that point, SCAF had no clear source of legitimacy. On March 19th, Egyptians voted for an interim constitution, stipulating that SCAF will transfer power back, and that's what they vowed to, a civilian government, a parliament, and then a democratically elected president. And this should be only in a 6-month period. According to the interim constitution, the permanent constitution should be written and approved by the people under elected government. The interim constitution gave some constitutional legitimacy to SCAF, but this legitimacy is bound by the stipulations of this interim constitution itself. SCAF violated the plan in the interim constitution so far, because we obviously exceeded the 6-month period. And not only it proposed a special status to the military, Egyptian military in the future constitution, but also proposes that the new constitution would be written while SCAF is still in power. The core issue with this special status is proposing that all laws related to military in the future should be approved by military leaders. And the military budget would be a secret budget without supervision from an elected bodies. SCAF also proposed that it should approve the permanent constitution. If we put this in context of the fact that Egyptian military controls from 25% to 40% of the Egyptian economy, with an annual aid of $1.3 billion from US for more than 30 years, activists and many Egyptians I spoke to and I worked with expressed serious concerns about SCAF's plans, not only because this may actually create or maintain, if we might, secrecy and corruption, but would also maintain a military state or make a military state above the state. Part of SCAF's justification for this special status is that they wanted the army to protect the civilian nature of the state from the rising Islamic forces. their justification is puzzling, because the transitional period showed that the army's most tolerated groups in Egypt in the transition were members of the old corrupt ruling party, in addition to members of the Islamic parties who violated election laws, and some of the conservative groups actually speeches of the hate, of hate, for example, from Salafi groups against Copts, against women, and against secular leaders of opposition and known faces of the revolution were unquestioned, while SCAF and military police were targeting secular, liberal, leftist use of the revolution. Many affirm that they talk about a potential deal between the army and the Islamic parties, especially the Freedom and Justice Party, which is a spokes party of that represents Muslim Brotherhood, to share power in the near future. Of course, things may be complicated than this, but it's a serious concern. So in general, the only one single reform that's done in the transition in terms of human rights was lifting barriers on establishing political parties and in enacting a fairer system for the general election. But despite this important development, many protesters and activists have been expressing concerns about the potential for establishing genuine democracy in Egypt, not only because the outcome of the election seemingly doesn't carry the change most youth, secular, liberal, and leftist forces hoped for, but actually due to the serious crackdowns on human rights throughout the transitional periods. And I'll give here very brief examples. For example, SCAF using propaganda machines against secular groups, against human rights groups, cracking on them, extending emergency law, and the two main issues were, for example, insisting on the two main violations of the interim constitution were violating the timeline that's proposed under the constitution, and the second is extending emergency status that was should have been ended on September according to this constitution. So here, this is a brief general picture on how strategies are used in human rights that reflect the situation. The first was a selective use of the old repressive legal structure to target activists and combine public pressures to bring in justice members from the old regime. So this is the dual combination of civil and military rule. And under SCAF, in the last 11 months, there were about 15,000 civilians were tried before military courts, and that exceeds the number of under Mubarak that was only 1,200 in 30 years. That's one example. Another example is the cracking down on human rights groups. A third is violently attacking peaceful rallies that ended up with killing and injuries, lots of injuries. In one incident is Coptic March on October and with their Muslim supporters, and another one is a sit-in before the Egyptian cabinet, and a third was a crackdown on Tahrir on November. So many activists I talked to say that SCAF wouldn't have carried this without a regional and international support. They name, for example, a flood of flowing money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar to support the conservative groups in Egypt. And also they speak about military aid to SCAF. For example, the Department of Justice in Egypt had evidence about Qatari government to give 181 million Egyptian pounds, which is an equivalent of $30 million to only one single Salafi NGO. And there's been evidence documented by Amnesty International about sending repressive weaponaries that have been coming to Egypt since the revolution by many governments, including the US. Okay, and so in general, I would argue against the false dichotomy. I feel that some blame entirely the gigantic security militarized state for the crackdown, and others are blaming the support from the West, and I would argue against this false dichotomy about blaming everything on the inside or the outside. And I would see there is an intersected interest between the deep, corrupt military class in Egypt on the one hand and the regional international interests on the other. So in a word, to conclude, a general picture is the following. We have three major actors, roughly speaking, in the second. And three main visions about what was the revolution all about. SCAF, the revolution meant for them only getting rid of Mubarak's succession plan and his son, and keep the repression and the corruption machine on. Islamic parties, mainly the Freedom and Justice parties and Salafist parties, the revolution for them perhaps was a political game. And the picture, of course, is complicated because the youth of the Brotherhood established new parties that's weaker and smaller, but that's a general picture. And the revolution for them, the major parties, meant a path to a parliamentary majority in which they replaced the old NDP or the former ruling party. And he seemed not to mind SCAF expanded power in the near future, at least. The third is a large spectrum of secular leftist working class activists who led, in fact, the revolution and made it possible. And they don't have any significant voice in the new parliament. So from the very narrow legal perspective and human rights perspective, the revolution does not seem to be succeeding so far or have a successful conclusion. It's neither success nor a failure. And some are saying that the military already succeeded in transforming the mass revolution into a military coup to maintain the militarized nature of the Egyptian state with the participation and the complicity of Islamic parties and the blessing of the West. Other activists are saying that this is superficially maybe true, but the situation is far from stable. Such stability only will come when ruling elites, especially the military, are willing to dismantle repressive security apparatus and undo some of the repressive, or if not all the repressive legal structure to meet the aspirations of the Egyptians. Also, some see the new parliament as not a true representation of the revolution or the society. So minimum stability in the near future will come only with serious reform to establish a rule of law, state of rule of law, and respect of human rights. And a better stability will come with economic and social justice. That was also another slogan in the revolutions. Both were significant demands of the revolutions. Both haven't been met so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Atef, as we go along, please be sure if you have questions that come up, be sure to write them down, and as we go on, pass them to our staff members and down here. So, but I'll cede the podium to Sussane Koelbl, who's going to speak about Syria.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you for being invited to participate on the panel. It is a great honor for me to find myself in such distinguished company. And I very much appreciate being given this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and experiences with you. As already mentioned, I'm a journalist. For the past 10 years, I've worked mainly as a foreign correspondent in Afghanistan and in various trouble spots in the Middle East. So rather than dealing with the subject in more abstract terms, I would like to talk about what is going on now in Syria, which I believe provides a good illustration of the way dictatorships work in that part of the world. More specifically, I would like to give you my reading of how Syrian President Bashar al-Assad got stuck where he is. That is why he is simply not able to make the reforms that clearly are needed, why it is now simply impossible for him to change direction, why, from his point of view, he has no other option but to fight it out to the bitter end. I had the opportunity to meet al-Assad personally 2 times. And over the years, I've also talked with a number of his friends and relatives, with people from the Syrian intelligence services and his generals. I've also spoken with some of, or many of the opponents of the regime. This picture, for instance, was taken in 2005. That means some 6 years ago, before the outbreak of what we now call the Arab Spring. It was taken at a meeting of a debating society in West Damascus during what was called at that time the Damascus Spring. The people you see were prominent intellectuals who belonged to the opposition. Most of them were imprisoned not too long after this meeting. The Damascus Spring was a time of hope and awakening, but it lasted only for a very short time. When the young president, Bashar al-Assad, succeeded his father in 2000, he promised his people profound political reforms: a multi-party electoral system, free elections, even the lifting of emergency rule, which has been in effect for over 40 years. The promise Bashar made, the hope he held out of that the country would be taken in an entirely new direction, very soon were proved to be, if not outright lies, certainly illusions. Personally, Bashar al-Assad is actually quite a moderate character. In his youth, he was never particularly interested in politics, and he certainly never sought power. By profession, he is an ophthalmologist. He's president literally by accident. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had originally chosen Bashar's older brother, Basil, to succeed him. It was only after Basil died in a car crash in 1994, on his way to the airport, that the successor role fell to Bashar. The Syrian dictatorship is a family business. Only a member of the family can be trusted to run it. Power is held by a few dozen men, with maybe a few hundred influential people who benefit from the system. What was at stake when Bashar became president was making sure that the family and their small circle of powerful friends were able to retain that power. Today, roughly a dozen years later, we can follow more or less live amateur videos of Syrian soldiers and intelligence agents, aided by mercenaries, using all the force at their command to put down the opposition. Demonstrators are being beaten to death. Civilians, even women and children, are being targeted by snipers. The wounded in the hospitals, instead of being treated, are being shot in their beds. How is it possible that this mercilessness, brutality, is being orchestrated by an eye doctor? He is well educated, a cultivated man. His wife, Asma, is a smart, elegant British finance expert. And was he not received with open arms only recently by French President Nicolas Sarkozy at the Élysée Palace in Paris? What we have here is what might call the dictator's dilemma. Assad and the small group of power holders around him know very well by this juncture that they have missed any chance that might have existed to transform the system peacefully. Quite probably they never had anything like that in mind. In any case, they know that anything they offer the demonstrators now, no matter what it is, would be too little and would be coming too late to satisfy the angry masses. A large portion of the Syrian people now wants to get rid of this regime, and at the top of the regime sits Assad. However nice a guy he may be in private. They want him out, and they want his family out with him. How did all this happen? The young Bashar al-Assad inherited a state that was created and shaped by his father, Hafiz al-Assad. The economy is still based on a more or less socialistic model. It has been opened up a little bit in recent years with the introduction of private rather than state-owned banks. And the media are state-controlled still, but some private investment is allowed, and access to outside media is possible now over the internet. But as for the government, the army and intelligence services are all powerful. And all of the key positions are held by a few carefully chosen relatives and friends. Al-Assad's younger brother Maher, a brother-in-law, uncles, nephews, cousins. Those few fully trusted men are almost all members of the Alawite sect, a Shia sect to which the Assads have long belonged. In this security apparatus that the president depends on to fight his enemies, both side and outside the country. It is the same apparatus that kept his father in power. And the inner circle in Syria knows very well that if they lose power, they can expect absolutely no mercy from their opponents. This is particularly true for the inner circle of the senior leadership, but it also applies more broadly to a large sector of the Alawite minority, which represent about 12% of the total population. This means that this fight is no longer about whether or not power-sharing agreement can be reached. It is a fight to the death. To understand the fierceness with which this struggle is being fought out and the mercilessness on both sides, one has to look back briefly into the history of the regime. When Bashar al-Assad's father seized power in a bloodless coup in 1971, he ended a period of ongoing instability in which the government was constantly being overthrown by coup. But the stability that Hafiz al-Assad managed to establish came at a very high price. The new president set up a highly efficient police state, and any opposition was suppressed with extreme brutality. The oppression reached a high point in 1982 with a horrific massacre in the city of Hama. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 30,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were killed alongside with their families. It was done by special forces using bombs and tanks. This is what the city looked like after the massacre. This massacre of tens of thousands of Syrian citizens was, of course, traumatic for the Syrian people and remains deeply engraved in the collective memory. The man on the left-hand side on this photograph was the one who then commanded the special forces in Hama. His name is Rifat al-Assad. He was the brother of Hafiz al-Assad, which makes him Bashar al-Assad's uncle. He was vice president of Syria at that time. Bashar al-Assad was a 17-year-old boy. This is Rifat al-Assad today. He has never acknowledged any responsibility for the massacre, and he has never been taken to justice for his part in it, of which there is not the slightest doubt. I met with the so-called Butcher of Hama for an interview last month in Paris. When I asked him about his role in 1982 in the massacre and the responsibility he bears for it, he blatantly denied any involvement whatsoever, and not only that, he even had the audacity to suggest himself as an alternative to his nephew Bashar al-Assad, whom he would like to replace as president to lead the country to freedom and democracy. It is this boundless arrogance and the impunity with which the perpetrators act, this trampling of justice, that angers the citizens of Syria so much and which is fueling the current uprising. What is different this time is that for the first time in 40 years, they seem to have shed their fear. And this uprising is mainly led by the well-educated younger generation. Now, how will dictatorship in Syria end, and will it end? What is different here from the situation in Egypt and Tunisia is that the Syrian security apparatus does not feel a strong obligation to the state, to the Syrian state as a state. Their duty is to the regime, more specifically to the Assad family. That makes a major difference. And so far, only a very few officers of higher ranks have defected from the Syrian army and switched to the other side. From a purely military point of view, the opposition definitely does not stand any chance of success in this uprising. They are trapped, and I'm very concerned that our screens will be filled with horrifying pictures from Syria for some time to come. Syria is a comparatively small country, but it is a key country in the Middle East. It lies at the crossroads between Israel, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey. The region is already highly unstable. If and how Syria falls is of crucial importance for the entire Middle East. As Syria goes, so possibly goes the entire region. If a regime change were to succeed, this could profoundly change the balance of forces in Arab politics. And it is far from clear whether we, the West and its allies in Europe and the region, will be pleased with the outcome. This presumably is the main reason why the West, and this includes Europe and neighboring Turkey, is not showing the same appetite for fighting in Syria as it did when it intervened in Libya. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. Nevertheless, it is not difficult to predict that the state in which Syria finds itself at the moment, at the brink of civil war, is likely to continue for quite some time to come. This would take much longer than it did in Tunisia, Egypt, or Libya, and the cost and bloodshed will presumably be much, much higher. Thank you.
Thank you, Sussane. And we'll continue with Sarai, who's going to speak on the situation of Israel in this hall.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. For those of you who are following Israeli politics, domestic Israeli politics, it will not be surprising to know that the last year has been very, very significant in terms of domestic Israeli politics. And contrary to the widespread image of Israel as an island of stability, an image that even Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to invoke last year, I think at around, I think we can close this, right? To invoke last year, last winter, regional developments have actually influenced almost every level of Israeli society, from everyday encounters between the average man and woman to public media, new media, social media, and of course to official political decision makers. And But I will not talk today about recent domestic debates within Israel, such as the debate about women's exclusion, which is to some extent, in my opinion, connected to some of the other debates in the region, or to the wave of popular demonstrations, large-scale popular demonstrations within Israel in the last summer, basically connected to the high prices of housing and the cost of living. I will really not talk about these issues, but rather I bring them up to point out that Israelis live within this region and that they are very much aware, interested, inspired, and to some extent confused and afraid of the possible consequences that this transition period may bring. So on a more general level, the initial response of Israeli political and military leaders to the unfolding events last year in Tunisia and Egypt and later on Libya was a cautious wait-and-see strategy. Later on, in the summer, sometime in the summer, when it became clear that the Middle East as we knew it had changed and that the authoritarian regimes are losing their power, it became clear that Israeli strategic position in the region needs to be reassessed. And so sometime in the summer, we start seeing much more active initiatives and attempts to deal with emerging security threats, or what is perceived by the Israeli establishments as security threats. So, for example, we have recently seen a certain reform in the military that is based on new assessments of different possibilities of regional war or other forms of violence. And another example is a recent project of building a physical barrier, a wall on Israel's southern border, between Israel and the Sinai. And this is a project that has been debated for many years now, but it gained momentum and was actually started to be constructed after the fall of Mubarak. So we actually see changes on the ground that have been influenced by the regional changes during the last year. Now, in analyzing Israel's current strategic position, as it is perceived from an Israeli perspective, and when I say an Israeli perspective, I mean the perspective of military and political elites. The main question is whether the era of relative normalization that was formally embodied in the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, so 30 years now of relative normalization, later on the Oslo Accords, the peace with Jordan, and even the Arab Initiative in 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative. So whether this relative normalization era is coming to an end. And when I say normalization, I mean a certain degree of regional cooperation on a multilateral or bilateral level. And just another example, one of the consequences of the recent collapse of the Israel regional alliance with Egypt and Turkey is the fact that Israel is seeking new allies in the Mediterranean, and these include Cyprus and Greece. And these new alliances are based on shared interest, not only security interests but also economic and other. And the central to this alliance is the relatively new discovery of natural gas fields in the Mediterranean, and the question of using energy in this region. And since 2008, Egypt has emerged as one of the important suppliers of natural gas to Israel, and through an undersea pipeline. In the past few months, there have been numerous attempts to interrupt this gas supply. And according to Israelis, the Israeli authorities, it is unlikely that popular opposition within Egypt will keep supporting exporting gas to Israel. So Israel must develop its domestic gas sources. So we're seeing like these real concrete issues that are now coming on the table. Now, to go even further, the strategic assessments that are published by Israeli officials tend to be very grim. It is widely believed that Yemen and Syria will follow a similar transition to that which we have seen in Tunisia. So in Israel, the main assumption is that Bashar al-Assad will eventually have to leave in some way or another. Netanyahu's prediction, which he keeps saying, but not only him, also the military, is that the Arab Spring will inevitably cause the rise of militant Islamic regimes. And at the same time, Israelis are beginning to understand that Arab public sentiments and public attitudes are becoming more relevant. With the changes in Egypt, the Sinai, the southern border, and the Golan Heights, the Syrian border, are becoming much more vulnerable locations. And the only positive, I'd say, prospects of this strategic position from the Israeli perspective are that with the weakening of Assad's regime, Hezbollah and Hamas may also have to readapt or change their strategic position or strategic stand towards Israel. And there are people who argue that we already see Hamas showing a more pragmatic approach with the Shalit deal, joining the PLO recently, and seriously negotiating with Fatah on reconciliation. So this might be a positive outcome. The current situation, it is very early to know which forces will actually fill the current political vacuum. But it seems that the Israeli security sector, which did not by any means predict the Arab Spring, is trying to redefine Israel's grand strategic position. So there are all sorts of scenarios on the table, from conventional war to diplomatic or political initiatives. And as we see, especially on the Iranian issue, the Iranian threat, whether it's real or imaginative, it is now entering a new and more aggressive form of a Cold War or a public diplomacy, and a much more aggressive form of public diplomacy, and this is new. And I think that we will see much more of that, and that's we should keep an eye on that, because it may escalate into violent conflict or even war, although not by all means. So going back to the main question, which is, will the limited normalization in Israeli-Arab relations survive the current political transition? Or will Israel, and I'm talking now about Israel, will Israel regress into what was once its dominant predisposition, which is what I call the siege reality or the siege mentality, of course, ironically, but yes, that's what was the situation 30 years ago. And there are certain indications that Israel is preparing for this kind of a scenario. Like, for example, the attempt to minimize political opposition from within, restricting activities of human rights organizations, restricting academic freedom, and especially by signaling Palestinian Israelis as a hostile group. So this question of the siege mentality from within is something that I think is interesting. And the last issue is that probably the prospect of maintaining some semblance of normalization currently under the current uncertainty are highly dependent upon the Palestinian issue. Ironically, the instability in the region and the international attention to Egypt, Libya, Syria, Tunisia has to some extent lowered the pressure that the Palestinian bid for statehood in the UN would have created, maybe in a different context. And last year, we have seen many unilateral actions. Israel has expanded settlements, in this, especially in what we call sea areas, continued to demolish houses, and prevented local inhabitants from going back to homelands. But the West Bank was one of the most relatively stable places in the Arab world last year. And some breakthroughs, like the Shalit deal, the Palestinian unity, opening the passage between Gaza and Egypt, were seen. And I think that this, again, we're seeing the status quo for a long time. The status quo is changing, but very, very, very slowly, and it is very fragile. And both Israelis and Palestinians know it. So given Israel's current problematic strategic position and regional uncertainty, on one hand, it is unlikely that Netanyahu and his right-wing government will willfully enter negotiations that might result in losing territories. The PLO, from their perspective, also needs some more time to maximize the recent bid for statehood. So the recent revival of talks in Amman and we're talking about very recent, the third meeting being, I think, 2 days ago, may well be understood as an attempt to just gain more time until something happens, and simultaneously to keep unilateral steps, and also to keep the only regional ally from Israeli perspective, which is the Hashemite Jordanian kingdom. As time goes by, the risk of losing the last chance to maintain some sort of normalization in the region may prove, I think, to be an incentive for Israel to continue negotiations. And I would like to finish where I started. 2012 may turn out to be a decisive period in defining Israel's position within the changing Middle East. Now it is the increasing Iranian nuclear threat and the Palestinian and EU, especially, demands for settlement freeze that form the most concrete dilemmas for how to act in a changing region. Yet, although many of these issues will be probably determined by external actors like the EU, the US, and Iran, I also think that the Israeli public opinion will play a central role in future developments. As long as we, and this is something that we know, as long as we don't see large-scale violence against Israelis in Israel, my guess is that the Israeli public may be more favorable towards political concessions through negotiations. And we are entering the beginning of the 2013 or earlier election period in Israel. This would be really interesting to see how these developments unfold in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just remind you to as your questions come up, please write them down, pass them on, and if you run out of writing material, ask for more. Now, at this point, let me turn it over to Juan Cole.
Thank you. So I'm coming at the end of very rich comments, and I think my role might be to try to step back and take a wider view of things. Let me begin by just asking the question: is what was that happened there in 2011 in the Middle East? What was going on here? And if we look at it from the point of view of political economy, of struggle, can't say exactly classes, but of large social groups with one another, it might become a little clearer. The systems that existed in places like Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Yemen were different from one another to some extent, but they had some commonalities. First of all, they were authoritarian regimes. They had relatively narrow elites. The U.S. Embassy wrote back to Washington in 2006, according to cables released by Bradley Manning, that 50% of the economic elite of Tunisia was related to the president. So that's bad news if you're not related to the president. While it wasn't quite so bad in Egypt, nevertheless, we now know the Mubaraks, embezzled billions, maybe 40 to 70 billion from the country and stashed it around the world, and their cronies and so forth. So these were relatively narrow elites. They were predatory. In Tunisia, if you had a small business that started to do well, one of the president's in-laws would show up and say, well, this is a nice business you have here. It would be too bad if something happened to it. But I could take it off your hands, relieve you of this anxiety for a small sum, a very small sum. So they were predatory. They would actually snarf up the best economic opportunities from the rest of the population. They were exclusionary. The state functioned as a set of patronages. on the one hand, it had a constituency in the state employees. And the state employees often were a very large group. Often these states had a background in the socialist period of the 1960s. So in Egypt, at some point, maybe half of the full regular employment in the country back in the 80s was in the public sector. I mean, this is incredible. And the purpose of the Egyptian state was to take care of those employees, pay them on time, make sure they had proper lives, and so forth. Even the private sector in these countries was, in a way, often an appendage of the state. First of all, the state licensed private enterprises, so you couldn't get a license unless you were in thick with the ruling family. So Ahmed Az, the famous or notorious Egyptian steel magnate, was given a license to have a steel company. He was close to Gamal Mubarak. He became a billionaire. And then when they put the Egyptian steel company, his only competition was a state steel company. When they put it on a block, he bought it. And then he gradually reduced its size and fired people and built up his own industry at its expense. The banking system in Tunisia, as demonstrated by a scholar named Ibu, functioned as state patronage, because even the private banks would give out loans to people based on how close they were to the Ben Ali family. And then, if they were close to the Ben Ali family, it was impossible ever to collect the debt. The government would periodically forgive the debts of its clients and cover those debts with European Union and other aid money. So every time the Europeans gave some money to Tunisia, it went into the state coffers. Some of it would be given out to the banks to stabilize the financial system, which meant forgiving the loans that had been made to Ben Ali's relatives and cronies. So again, if you weren't in with the elite, you would be foreclosed on, but if you were, then you never would be. And this system was a kind of Ponzi scheme, because obviously you can't run these economies like that forever. You can't, the banks can't be overextended forever. You can't keep forgiving the loans of even the elite forever. And it also created haves and have-nots, that a system that was vulnerable to a downturn in the same way that Ponzi schemes are vulnerable. You know, as long as Mr. Madoff was in an economy that was growing, you never knew he had a Ponzi scheme. It's only when the economy turned down that he couldn't cover all of the so-called investments, and then it becomes clear that there's nothing there. Well, in the same way, I think the downturn of 2008, 2009 harmed these Ponzi schemes in the Middle East. And so the have-nots, who were they? Well, they were the educated young people who suffered very high rates of unemployment from this system, because the corruption was so great that foreign companies wouldn't want to invest in places like Tunisia and Egypt very much, because all the officials had their hands out all the time, and it was just a hassle, and it was also, could get you in trouble with the Department of Justice if you paid them off. So people just avoided it. And we think that 1%, 2%, 3% a year of economic growth was forestalled by this corruption. Well, if starting in 1990 you had 3% extra growth a year in Tunisia and Egypt, you might not have had revolution. You might not have had such high unemployment among the educated youth. So the educated young people were one group that were have-nots in this system. Very large numbers of them were forced abroad just to find a job. The Egyptian workforce is 25 million or so. 3 million were working out of the country. There were 800,000 Tunisians in Europe, in a country of only 10.5 million people, and so the workforce is much smaller. I mean, that's enormous. There were no prospects for these people, and of course, what happened in 2008, 2009, to some extent even 2010, is that those foreign opportunities to work were foreclosed. People were fired; they couldn't get jobs even abroad because of the international economy turning down. The workers were most often on the wrong side of these tracks. There were only state unions. The unions were working for the government, not for the workers. There were major strikes in Gafsa in southern Tunisia, at a phosphate mine, at the Helwan textile mills in Egypt. And these were brutally put down. Nevertheless, there were 4,000 strikes, labor actions in Egypt between 2003 and 2010. And so the workers were obviously, for the most part, on the wrong side of this divide. Wealth was being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands of a few billionaires. And then, when you had the economic downturn, the state often could no longer even take care of its own constituencies. So the Egyptian office workers were no longer getting paid as much or getting paid on time. Their working conditions were declining. And so that major constituency of the state, which was the state workers themselves, became increasingly dissatisfied. Well, if you've got the educated young people, the workers, the government workers and office and white-collar workers, all against you, because of the state's inability to take care of more than a narrow upper elite of billionaire cronies, then you've got the makings for a revolution. Now, how have these transitions gone? Well, you know, in one sense, if you got rid of the Ben Alis and the Trabelsis, the family mafia that ran Tunisia, it opens up quite a lot of space in political economy. I mean, there's room now for other people to have enterprises and to grow, assuming that the problem of extensive corruption can begin to be addressed. And that's why, one of the reasons, you know, that Mark Tessler was saying people voted for Islamist parties, it wasn't for the most part because Tunisians are, you know, really, really pious people. A lot of them are secular. But they thought that these parties that had been out of power had been in exile and which characterized themselves as primarily interested in justice might be less corrupt. So if the corruption issue can be addressed, then there could be just a lot more economic opportunity in a place like Tunisia or Egypt in the aftermath. On the other hand, in some countries, the narrowness of the government's economic activities and the exclusion of people hasn't been quite so great, or hasn't been to the extent that even kind of the upper middle classes would join in the revolution. And that would help to explain what happened in Syria, to some extent in Yemen and in Bahrain, where you had these movements, but where they haven't entirely succeeded in displacing the old elite. And it's because the old elite is still somewhat happy with the regime. So in Syria, you haven't had massive demonstrations in Damascus or Aleppo, because there are a lot of people in those cities that are still benefiting from the patronage of the regime. Likewise, the demonstrations in Bahrain were put down not only by a Sunni monarchy with backing from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the United States against the Shiite majority, but also a joint Sunni Shiite business class in Bahrain, which didn't want all this trouble and which put pressure on the king to act. Where you had still the state having a substantial support among the state bourgeoisie, the state and the business classes that are tied to the state, the revolutions haven't gone so well. Likewise, the military has been very important in each country in determining the transition's success. In Tunisia, you had a very small military, 30,000 men, and it wasn't, and it had been kept small, I think, by Ben Ali, who was a general and didn't want any other generals getting ideas about making coups. But a small army like that simply wasn't going to be able to take on 200,000 or 300,000 people in the streets of the capital, much less all of the demonstrations all throughout the country. So I think that the transition in Tunisia went relatively well, in part simply because it had a small military and the temptation to repress was much less. It wasn't plausible. In Egypt, it's been a mixed picture. The military has made a coup, essentially, and Egypt is still being governed more or less by the military. It's a large military, 450,000 men or so, but 380,000 of those are conscripts. And there is a bit of a problem for the Egyptian military in the sense that it can't be entirely sure that the conscripts would obey an order to fire into crowds. So when the crowds have been fired on, it's been more the Amnadallah, the state security police, and more professional soldiers might have been involved. But there's still that, another shoe to drop in Egypt as to how much power the military can retain and how much its conscript base would be willing to side with the officer corps against the people. Whereas, and in Libya we saw that the military was relatively small, very professionalized, included mercenaries, had nothing to do with the people, and so it was perfectly willing to line up tanks and shoot at peaceful demonstrators. And it was only a foreign military intervention against the tank corps that allowed the revolutionaries to come to power. In Syria, the officer corps and even the middling officers are very tied to the regime, partly, as Susanna said, because of sectarian reasons. But the Syrian elite is somewhat diverse, and we haven't seen a lot of defections. So the army is sticking with the regime in Syria. In Yemen, there were some defections, but still, the majority of the army is with the regime. And that helps to explain why there's been more compromise in Yemen. In Bahrain, of course, the army is very much with the regime, and it's gotten reinforcements from Saudi Arabia. So in each country, the positioning of the military was different and helped to determine the outcome. The new Middle East that we're going to see as a result of these changes, where the changes have a discernible direction, is going to be more independent of the West. It's not going to be so tied to Paris on the one hand, or London, or Washington on the other. It is likely to have more opportunity economically, or there will be trouble about it. Won't have such narrow elites. It's likely to have more input into law and public practice from Muslim fundamentalist groups, at least in the medium or short term, because it could be in subsequent elections a backlash. So the revolutions have mainly been made by the left, but the aftermath of the revolutions has been new elections in which the Muslim fundamentalist parties were better organized and did better at the polls. So far in Egypt and Tunisia, and I expect the same thing will be true in Libya and Yemen. Were there to be a transition in Syria, certainly the Muslim Brotherhood would do very well. The big divide here geopolitically is between the West and the East. We would say in Arabic, the Mashriq and the Maghreb. In the West, there hasn't been a lot of sectarian issues. It's very distant from Iran. They're mostly Sunni and Arab. And so the transitions have been fairly uncomplicated. In the east of the Muslim world, there's been a Sunni Shiite dimension, and therefore an Iranian dimension, an Iranian versus Saudi Arabian dimension to the conflicts, which have made them much more complicated and have affected their outcomes. So Iran and Iraq are supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria, I think not so much because of solidarity with Alawite Shiites, who they consider heretics, but because they're afraid that more radical Sunnis might come to power and interfere with Iranian and Iraqi foreign policy. Likewise, the Shiite tinge to the uprising in Bahrain made the Saudis eager to crush it because they saw it then as a cat's paw of Iran, which is a Shiite country. And so this kind of Sunni Shiite Cold War, Iranian-Saudi Cold War has affected the outcome in the East of these changes. Were Syria to fall, I think it would be very, very bad for Hezbollah in Lebanon because their supply lines would be cut off. And it might encourage more Israeli adventurism in southern Lebanon of the sort we saw back in the 80s. And therefore, Hezbollah has been strongly behind the Syrian regime, much to the disappointment of many Lebanese who would like to see al-Assad go. There is that big, strong West-East divide in how we should approach the analysis of this, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists. We have time for questions, and thanks to everybody who has passed some on. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Professor Mark Tessler, was called away, so I'll set aside a little bit those questions that were specifically addressing his presentation. But let me start with a very general question that has been raised. And I would ask every panelist to address it as they see fit, which is this: in what ways do you think the Arab Spring changes U.S. foreign policy? And would those movements inspire a sense of agency among the general mass against Western interventionist policies? So whoever wants to directly speak to that.
My general take on this, so like from my reading to U.S. empire in the Middle East, last few decades, that they're still figuring out what to do, but try to configure an ally. That's when the general theme about the strategic allies is a key issue that U.S. foreign policy is based upon. And of course, there is threads of public diplomacy, and at least in the last decade, U.S. is not only working with officials, but trying to work with NGOs, and that's why the recent attacks on U.S. democratic offices, NGI, for example, and others in Egypt, was U.S. government was upset, seriously upset, not just because of the larger crackdown on human rights, but also about this too. So in general, the U.S. is talking with the Brotherhood. I'm talking about Egypt specifically. Senator John Kerry, a few weeks ago, visited the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters in addition to meeting the military. Frank Wisner recently, last week, was in Egypt and trying to talk to the potential leaders of the parliamentary majority. So it's not clear, but combining old strategies and investing on the new strategies that he had been doing for the last decade or so, which is the public diplomacy, working with youth groups, inviting them here to talk to campuses, people from the 6 April movement or others. Some accepted to do so, some actually refused to accept official U.S. invitations, and they come only with NGOs and rights groups to the U.S. So that's it.
Well, the United States has a few discrete interests in the Middle East. I should say, first of all, that despite the emphasis on it in the press and so forth, the Middle East is not that important to the United States per se. I think the total external trade to the United States of the Arab world is something like $90 billion a year. I mean, it's tiny. So what is the United States interested in the Middle East for? Well, the United States would very much like that the hydrocarbon resources of the region are exported freely. So anything that interfered with that would be a matter of national security. Not so much for the United States itself, although the U.S. does import a lot of petroleum from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region, but for allies. Japan is very heavily dependent on Middle Eastern petroleum, especially that of the United Arab Emirates. Europe is as well, and so forth. So petroleum security is one of the big U.S. interests. Because of domestic reasons, the security of Israel is very important to U.S. foreign policy. And then, as an adjunct to those two things, it's important to the U.S. to contain the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is an avowed enemy of the United States, an avowed enemy of Israel, is seen as playing a sinister role in Washington. Washington sees Iran as playing a sinister role in the region, and therefore has been putting ever-increasing sanctions and even now an oil embargo on Iran to keep it weak and to prevent it from making what the U.S. sees as mischief. So if those are the foreign policy imperatives of the United States, petroleum, Israel, and anti-Iran measures, how does the Arab Spring affect them? The answer so far, not very much. Tunisia is irrelevant to all that. It has no hydrocarbons to speak of and not involved particularly in the Arab-Israeli issue. And therefore, the United States really didn't seem to pay very much attention to the Tunisian revolution while it was unfolding. And then after it was over, President Obama came out and gave a speech in which he congratulated the Tunisians and wished them well. So all of that tells me that they don't care very much, you know, whether Mounsef Marzouki is the president of Tunisia or Zainuddin Ben Ali was. And with regard to Egypt, likewise, not a producer of hydrocarbons. Its main role in petroleum security would be with regard to keeping the Suez Canal open, through which I think about 10% of the world's petroleum flows. But, and then, you know, a similar amount of just world trade. But there's been no particular question that the Suez Canal would be closed by what happened in Egypt. And then all of the major forces in politics in Egypt, including the Muslim Brotherhood, have said that they're not interested in reneging on the Camp David peace accords. They might want to renegotiate some articles, but there's no question that anybody who's coming to power now in Egypt wants a war with Israel. And so as you go down the line, Yemen, likewise, not a hydrocarbon state, not involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict particularly. There's a security issue because it has about 300 al-Qaeda operatives, but let's face it, that's not the end of the world. So as you go down the line, virtually none of these countries affects U.S. foreign policy. So the one place where petroleum and Gulf security might be affected would be Bahrain, and there the U.S. has kind of acquiesced in the crushing of that movement. And then, you know, Syria could be, again, not a hydrocarbon state, but it does have implications for the Israel issue. But there doesn't seem to be much concern in either the United States or in Israel that whoever came after Bashar would necessarily want to go to war with Israel. I think that Israel has been built up as a military power to the point where it's not really threatened by any conventional military in the region, regardless of who would be in control of it. So the Arab Spring has, in my view, just doesn't so far vitally threaten U.S. foreign policy interests in the region. And as long as that's the case, I think the U.S. can live with whatever is developing there. It might have preferred the status quo, but it can live with what's developing. And in some instances has even played a positive role. So the Obama administration has put pressure on the Egyptian military to lighten up, and they wanted them to abrogate the security laws and so forth. So I think the U.S. is kind of adjusting, but I think the reason for which you haven't seen a more muscular U.S. foreign policy response to these changes is partly their people power movements, and so there's not very much the U.S. could do about them anyway, but partly is they have unfolded in places and in ways that don't really affect vital U.S. interests in the region.
A brief comment to that? I certainly cannot imagine that CIA sits in. Oh, sorry. What is it?
Just bring it close.
All right. All right.
You have to love
now?
the mic.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I cannot imagine that the CIA sits in front of YouTube and just doing nothing. I mean, like for instance, when it comes to Syria, certainly there are certain scenarios you don't want to see as an outcome. You don't want to see civil war as a longer-lasting phenomenon there. And certainly you want to have somebody there who is possibly prepared to make peace with Israel. And Assad, for instance, probably is prepared to make peace with Israel if they would be prepared to give back the Golan Heights and 100% of the Golan Heights. So Assad was not the worst enemy you could have. I mean, the successor is maybe, yeah, you want to choose the successor as well. The replacement should be somebody whom you can work with. And certainly you have another interest, means that Iran should not gain more influence as it already has. You actually want to control that influence and even, if possible, to reduce this. So, I mean, even it does not affect the foreign policy of the U.S. fundamentally. I'm sure that the U.S. very carefully watches this, and the main concern, as Juan already said, is certainly to make sure that the oil supplies from the Gulf region will not be disturbed.
Okay, just a short remark. I actually think that the current U.S. Foreign policy was in the region has changed and reshaped after the end of the Cold War, and so what we're actually might be seeing now would be much increased global alliances that go far beyond the region. And I think that what's happening with Russia and things that are happening within the Security Council may indicate that that the Secretary of State and to some extent the administration is worried about the global position of the U.S. now. And I think that there is a difference between the way things are seen from here and the way things are seen within the region. And I don't know if it's realistic, but there is a sense within the region that American power or American influence is decreasing. And that would be interesting to think about the way this perception plays in the process of local communities, people, countries defining their political projects on their own terms as independent people. That's just my point.
So I would like to use my mother language now to answer this question. Okay, so and Dr. Atef, he will try to translate my answer. الهدف من الربيع العربي أنه كشف للعالم بأن هناك فاصل, there is big gap between the government and the people.
Yeah, one of the main bottom lines of the Arab Spring was the big divide between elites and governments and people.
وهذا الشيء اتضح للعالم أجمع بأنه حقوق الإنسان غير موجودة في العالم العربي.
And human rights was a main concern or a drive motivation for Arab Spring protests.
وما تسعى إليه الولايات المتحدة باستمرار بأنها تساند حقوق الإنسان غير موجودة في العالم العربي أصلاً.
Yeah, and at least a main narrative of the U.S. foreign policy, one of the key issues is human rights and democracy.
وهذا غير موجود. لذلك فأتخيل أنه الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تعلمت من درس العراق.
And the U.S. Presumably learned the lesson from Iraq.
لأنه حينما حاولت أن تساعد الشعب العراقي للإطاحة بصدام حسين فإنها دخلت كمحتل وليس كمحرر.
Yeah, and when their process in helping or intervening in Iraq for a humanitarian reason, they end up being an occupier or an occupying force in Iraq.
لكن الآن ما حصل في العالم العربي بأنه الربيع العربي أعطى للولايات المتحدة فرصة لمساعدة الشعب بدون فكرة الاحتلال.
So the Arab Spring made an opportunity or created an opportunity for the U.S. to intervene or to help democracy without military intervention.
لذلك فصورة الولايات المتحدة بعد الربيع العربي تحسنت عند الشعوب العربية.
U.S. image in the Middle East has been better in the Arab Spring in the way the U.S. dealt with the Arab Spring.
لذلك ينظر الآن للولايات المتحدة كمخلص للشعوب كنصيرة للشعوب.
So the U.S. By the official policy or official narrative at least, the outcome was that U.S. is portrayed as supporter for the U.S. for the Middle East for the Arab Spring motivations or aspirations.
وأعتقد أن هذا سيجعل مستقبل السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية وعلاقة العرب بالأمريكان علاقة متوازنة وجيدة.
So the Arab Spring, according to Dr. Wijdan, brings hope to improve the image of the U.S. and Arab-U.S. relation.
Okay, شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you.
Let me just move on to another question. In a way, it's specifically, I think, addressing you, but I hope others can weigh in as well. Given the changes effected throughout the region by mass protests, why have we not seen more mass protests by West Bank Palestinians protesting either both Israeli occupation or Fatah's ineffective administration? So, is there a good answer to that?
Well, actually, I think Palestinians have been demonstrating for years. I think that this is a good question, but the situation in the West Bank and Gaza is somewhat different. And as many of the people here explained, the motivations have been accumulating for years under very specific conditions, which are to some extent different conditions. The West Bank and the protests in the West Bank have been continuing basically against the Israeli occupation, which is the main reason for protests in the West Bank and not against local corruption or elite. And we're seeing a very different effort of state building, which is basically going in a different direction, building institutions in a very systematic way, together with international agencies and also local governments. And this is, as I see it, a process of construction, of constructing, of an effort of building a nation. And there seems to me that this is somewhat there's a very different power that's working within Palestinian society now. It's not the power of internal anger, conflicts, but rather something else. And there is basically a long-term tradition of protest and resistance and violent and nonviolent. And so I think we should remember that in this context.
Yeah. Well, of course, we need Mark Tessler here to answer this question because he's the one who's been doing the opinion polling on the ground in the West Bank. But my own feeling is that in those countries where you saw big uprisings earlier on, and especially where those uprisings were defeated, you haven't seen so much protest in this round. And so Algeria and Palestine have some commonalities. And after the generals in Algeria canceled the results of the 1991 parliamentary elections because the Muslim fundamentalists won, the country was thrown into a long period of instability and even you could maybe call it civil war, in which perhaps 100,000 people were killed, and there were village massacres and so forth, and massacres on both sides by the Muslim fundamentalists and by the military. And in Palestine, you had two intifadas, two big uprisings, one in the late 80s and the other beginning in 2000, and both of them were more or less crushed, and the situation, political and socioeconomic situation of the Palestinians is worse now than it was before those uprisings. So the per capita income of the Palestinians in Gaza is actually declined, and the more and more territory has been taken away from the more land, more water, resources, et cetera, have been taken away from the Palestinians in the West Bank. So I think there's a certain amount of political discouragement among the Palestinians that any getting together in the center of Ramallah would alter their situation is a little unlikely, and it's actually a little worrisome to me that they're so discouraged, because severe discouragement causes severe political problems down the road.
Let me propose one more question for the end, certainly that raises some also sociological issues. What is the history of the higher educational system? The highly educated young people, did regimes support their education, and if so, why? Anybody wants to speak to that?
As Professor Cole touched upon, in the case of Egypt, at least there is the narrow elite. There is lots of money in Egypt, and there is good education system, relatively speaking, compared to the region. So, and many travel. You have get education outside. So, higher education is one of the earliest higher education in the region, and actually many countries in the Arab world have good education system, and so it's actually the general picture here is that this high degree of education and PhDs actually and masters, and there is, for example, that's I'll end one note here. After the revolution, and there was significant number of protests before the cabinet for master and PhD holders, like sometimes thousands, who don't have jobs. Some of them work in state employees in a low rank state employees, and they are not positioned not in a government job, and also corruption touched upon the universities, public universities. So on the one hand, there's good number of highly educated people. This is not reflected in jobs. And therefore, it's a situation that's still unfulfilled, unresolved.
Yeah. Sussane, and then Wijdan?
Okay. Very briefly, I think higher education plays a big role here. When I may come back to the example of Syria, this. When you visited Syria for the last, I did this for the last 10 years, there was such a depoliticized society which you saw. And it's obvious that the young, well-educated people now demand that a future is provided to them, which they feel is robbed by these elites which have been mentioned already. And they want, it's interesting that to see that especially these young, well-educated people are the ones who are suffering from unemployment. It's not the common worker. They have a job, but if you have studied and if you ask for a proper job, it's not available. And this is what they feel that they are betrayed by their elites, and this is why they take this issue to the street. And certainly it's the young people who have access to Facebook or internet. So it's not a Facebook generation, but it's a generation which can make use of that, and not everybody has this access. Certainly it's people from the university, from universities who are carrying quite large, who contribute very strongly to this revolution.
English. So I think the dictatorships, they have like a static picture about their people. It means they will never do anything. And the education itself doesn't work with the dictatorship. It means I will give them an opportunity, but this is not my right or not my job to give them opportunity to work. So the important thing happened in this revolution. The educated people, they have a job. For example, Wael Ghanem, he has a job. He is the manager of Google in yeah. So this education helped the people to cross the fear barrier. So like the word surprised about Arab Spring, also the dictatorship in our country surprised the educated people could break this fear barrier. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at the end of our time. There's obviously a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Let me conclude with one here. Is the word spring in Arab Spring appropriate? Is it Western wishful thinking? And I think I can answer for the whole panel as a whole to say we hope not. Thank you all for coming.